You're listening to the NFPT podcast, where we help aspiring trainers pass their exams and launch their fitness careers. Welcome back to the NFPT podcast. This is all about helping you pass your CPT exam with full confidence because becoming a successful certified personal trainer does not have to be complicated. I'm your host, Erin Mahoney, General Manager of NFPT, and also a longtime certified personal trainer. And today we are talking about pulling movement patterns. So let's dive into why movement patterns in general is important for CPT test day. First of all, knowing movement patterns are going to help you nail questions that are related to some key testing domains. Remember, the way the exam questions are written are according to testing domains. So the first testing domain it's going to help you out with is human anatomy. Then it's also going to help you answer questions related to fitness assessments because a pulling motion is a movement assessment that you can do with clients. And then ultimately, the outcomes of those fitness assessments is to help you identify what are the overactive and underactive muscles so you can effectively design the best programs possible for your client. And then lastly, exercise technique, which is also important. When you know what these movement patterns should be looking like, then you are able to quickly explain what exercise technique should look like during these motions. So let's chat real quickly about how pulling movement patterns can show up on your exam. First, and this is related to human anatomy, you might get a question where it asks you to name the agonist, antagonist, or synergist of a motion at a specific joint, and that's human anatomy. Then it also might show up where you are asked to identify what is the movement compensation that is happening when you see something during a movement assessment, specifically a pulling movement assessment. And then when you are able to see what those movement compensations are, then you'll have questions where you have to analyze what are the overactive or underactive muscles associated with those movement compensations. And that collectively is going to help you make the right stretching and strengthening protocols. So, all of this kind of builds together, especially those last three: identifying movement compensations, analyzing the overactive and underactive muscles, and then recommending the right stretching or strengthening protocols. So, that's why it's important. Now, let's go ahead and dive into what are the joint motions happening during a pulling motion. So, first and foremost, we have shoulder extension. Now, this gets a little confusing for some people. So, when you think about doing a row, let's say, and you're wanting to identify what is the joint motion at the shoulder, what you want to do is do that row, but just keep your elbows totally straight. And so, when you do that, you'll see your arms are going to go back and behind you. That is shoulder extension. So, that's what's happening at the joint during a pulling motion or a row exercise. Then you've also got scapular retraction. So this is when the shoulder blades slide back in towards the spine. And then lastly, we have elbow flexion. So this is what's happening during a pull down or any type of row activity. Now remember, when you are asked a question about whether the muscle is a agonist or antagonist, make sure that you're identifying what the joint motion is first. Now let's talk about those muscle synergies in the pulling movement pattern. So we've got our agonist. Remember, your agonist is the prime mover during the exercise. And the agonist, the muscle that is responsible for shoulder extension during a pull, is the latissimus dorsi and the posterior deltoid. Think of the lats, and when you are doing so, it's not just during a lat pull down, but it's also during a row because it's that same motion. We're still going into shoulder extension, regardless of whether we're doing a row or a lat pull down or a pull up. Now, if these are the agonists at the shoulder, then there's an antagonist, and the antagonist here is going to be your pectoralis major. Then you've got some muscles that are synergists. So these are the muscles that are helping out during that pulling motion. They're not responsible to do all of it, but they're there to help out. And that includes the teres major, the rhomboids, and the middle traps. And lastly, we have the stabilizer muscles. So those are the muscles that are there to help unwanted motion and to give a strong, solid foundation for the exercise. And at the shoulder, that is our rotator cuff muscles. Now that's just the shoulder, right? So we're doing shoulder extension there. Now let's take a look at the elbow joint. And this one's really easy for you. So the agonist during a pulling motion is the biceps brachii. And then the antagonist, the muscle group that opposes this, is the triceps. All right, let's jump into movement compensations during pulling. Now, the different compensations that you're going to see first is you might see the elbows winging out when, and this would be during, like, for example, a seated row. The elbows might wing out a little bit. And as that happens, what also could happen is your shoulders are going to round forward a bit. And that's really common with clients. And what we know is happening is it's very likely that they have overactive pectorals and overactive anterior deltoids. So, what's happening when those elbows wing out and the shoulders round forward is the client doesn't have the proper range of motion to pull all the way back into shoulder extension, but they're trying to avoid cutting that motion short. So they continue to pull, but their shoulders round forward. So then we've got the overactive muscles on the front of the body, the pectorals and the anterior deltoids. Now, what you also might see is their back arching. And this is also a movement compensation that you would see during a pushing movement pattern. So the overactive and underactive muscles are going to be the same thing. When the back arches, we know, regardless of the motion, it is very likely that they have underactive core stabilizers and overactive hip flexors. And they also might have overactive lats because remember, those lats connect down into the lower back. So when they're overactive, it causes a bit of an arch in the lower back. Now, what you could also see is shoulder elevation. So this is when the shoulders go up. And the problem there is that the lower traps aren't engaging to keep those shoulder blades in place and pulling downward. And then similarly, the upper traps are overactive. So they're drawing the shoulder blades up and everything up and towards the ears. And that's considered a movement compensation. And then lastly, we have a forward head. And this looks like when the head just migrates forward, especially when the movement gets more challenging. And in that instance, the underactive muscles are the deep cervical flexors, and the overactive muscles are the cervical extensors. All right, so that was a brief rundown of the different motions that are going on during a pulling movement pattern. Now let's talk about some example test questions that could show up. I'm not going to include answer options, and I think that's a good thing because oftentimes it's helpful for you to be able to think through what the question is asking before you try to choose from the answer options. So, an example of how this might show up on test day is like this: a client's shoulders elevate during a row. What is an ideal stretch for this movement compensation? So this would go to a program design testing domain. So the client's shoulders are going up during that row. That's the movement compensation that we see. So what should we be stretching when we know that the shoulders are elevating? In our last conversation, we know that by the shoulders elevating up that we have upper traps being overactive. So a great exercise that you can do, a lengthening exercise, is to stretch the upper traps. And that would be an appropriate answer to that question. Let's do another one. What exercise can be used to develop upper back strength? Now, this is really straightforward and very easy. I'm sure you've already got it. The answer is a row. Okay. So, a row, whether it's a bent over row or a seated row, it doesn't matter. But this is an example of how an exercise selection question might show up on your CPT exam. And then lastly, we have the example of why might a client's low back arch during a seated row exercise. And so with this one, this is also talking about movement compensations or what we're seeing when we do a movement assessment. And we know when their back is arching, they likely have those weaker core stabilizers and overactive hip flexors. So these are three examples of how pulling motions might show up on test day. Now, remember, when you go to take your CPT exam, you will need to know about muscle synergies, which is the movement patterns we just discussed. What muscles are responsible for what motion at the joint during the exercise? And then movement assessments. So, when you're doing a pulling movement assessment, what is overactive? What is underactive? And how do you deal with that? What are the stretching and strengthening exercises that you should do? So, as part of the NFPT Core 4 learning model, we want you to know those foundational concepts first. Then, what you can do is you can practice this movement impairment. So, go through those different movement impairments that we just talked about and feel where those overactive muscles might be and the underactive muscles, and then ultimately gain confidence with the test questions and with clients. So you can gain confidence with the test questions by going through our exam prep webinar series or taking practice tests and quizzes. And then in working with clients, just be watching every single motion that they do and trying to identify where their movement compensations are. All right, that's it. Remember, the NFPT differentiator is CPT success should not be complicated. And that is why NFPT is here to help you not only pass your exam, but also be successful and long term in the fitness industry. So if you haven't already, enroll in your NFPT CPT today and get more like this at your fingertips. And check out our recorded exam prep series. This supplements any CPT that you might be enrolled in. All right, that's it. Thanks for joining. Stay well, and we'll see you next time. Today's episode is brought to you by Summit Professional Education. Unlock your potential with Summit Professional Education, your trusted partner for expert-led courses, flexible learning, and essential CEUs. Elevate your skills today at summiteducation.com.